All right. Our first panelist is Thomas Bowers, who is involved with the Criminal Justice Citizens Advisory Council and I guess the ACLU as well. So please give a hand for Thomas Bowers, and I'll let him tell you about his background.
I'm a retired HR training and development director with W.W. Granger. Raised a family in Chicago. Fully retired. Love being retired. Gives me time to do things like this. We'll see if it's worthwhile how I spent my time. I've also been a hospice volunteer, and I'm involved with the Mixed Income Housing Coalition.
The next panelist is...
I'm Alex Fushnik. I consider myself a libertarian for as long as I've known what the term means. 2011, I actually ran for Charlotte City Council at large as a libertarian. I live down in South Charlotte with my wife and 2 daughters. Professionally, I'm a CPA, a small business owner. And I think the Second Amendment in particular, I think it's important from a constitutional issue to discuss it. But I think there's a lot of other issues about freedom and liberty that are dovetailed into it that are worth discussing as well.
Suzanne Rawls is the head of Moms Demand Action, North Carolina Southwest region.
Okay. Well, I'm a stay-at-home mom. I have 4 boys, and after Newtown happened, I had to do something because I couldn't take my kid to preschool. I was in shock, tears, and I had to. I had to get involved somehow to make it sure that this didn't happen again. So I'm here representing Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America, and it's a relatively new organization. It was formerly 1 Million Moms for Gun Control. We did change the name. It was founded by Shannon Watts in Illinois the day after Newtown, and because she had the same feeling that I did. And we now have 80 chapters across the U.S., and we're a fast-growing organization.
Thank you, Suzanne. And finally is Don Pomeroy from Grassroots North Carolina, and please explain what Grassroots North Carolina is.
Okay, sure. Thanks, Tim. Good evening. My name is Don Pomeroy. I just said that right. I'm so used to saying that at the beginning of events like this. Grassroots North Carolina is the preeminent Second Amendment rights support group or advocacy group here in North Carolina. So we're strictly state-focused, and of late we've branched out a little bit as part of a national coalition for gun rights to have some influence over what's happening and the discussions that are happening in Washington also. But predominantly our time is spent here in North Carolina. So for example, I've been on the board of directors now for a couple of years, but probably more importantly and more of the time I put in is on something called the Legislative Action Team. And our team actually goes to Raleigh. We are strictly volunteers, so we're not paid lobbyists. We're a fully volunteer organization. But we go as volunteers to Raleigh, and we walk the halls in the 2 legislative buildings when needed to try to influence or support gun legislation. So our group was started in the mid-90s when the assault weapons ban came into place, kind of in reaction to the initial 1994 assault weapons ban. And we've since then been the group that has sponsored and written the legislation for concealed carry, for the Castle Doctrine, and for a variety of other improvements to North Carolina law in order to enhance the rights of citizens in North Carolina when it comes to gun rights and self-defense. We're the ones that are behind that and often are the ones writing and presenting the legal changes in Raleigh.
All right, well, thanks so much for being here tonight. What we'll do is I'll read one of the leading questions, and the first question will start with Tom, the second question will start with Alex, and we'll rotate it so everyone has a chance to start out. And I think the best way to do this would be give each person maybe about 2 minutes to just give their response to the question, and then we'll try to do a few minutes of just crosstalk. This is not a debate. This is just a discussion. You know, nobody here wants to see gun violence, so I think a lot of times we get heated with some of these issues. So one of the main things I want to do is I just wanted us to discuss, the way I see it is there's trade-offs to everything. Maybe discuss the trade-offs of this versus that, and how, you know, how we can protect it. So this It's not a debate, it's a discussion. We'll try and keep it that way. And let's jump in. Panelists have any questions? Okay. So the first question I have is, this is just me not being familiar with firearms at all. So I hear the term assault rifle thrown out there. It's used frequently, especially in reference to gun control. What is your definition of what an assault rifle is? Is there a standard definition? Should there be one? I think this is an important question because it's thrown out there a lot, and I don't think it's very clear what it actually means. So we'll start with Tom.
I found that it's a cosmetic term that's used, and I'm going to define it as assault weapon. And it has at least 3 characteristics most often. It's going to vary a bit because it's cosmetic. But it's semi-automatic. Semi-automatic, 1 pull, 1 bullet. Don't have to put anything else in, pull it again, you get another bullet. That's semi-automatic. Has a detachable magazine. You hear lots in what you're reading in the paper about magazines and how many bullets, a pack of bullets that you can slide into it. And the other characteristic that I've seen, although not widely, is that it has a flexible stock. It can either be bent or be detached. So the weapon can be made smaller. But I think a more important question is, what is gun violence? And I hope as we proceed that the definition will be comfortable for all of us. Use of a firearm to threaten or inflict violence or harm. The United States has the highest rate of gun-related injuries. Injuries, not deaths. Among developed countries. It also has the highest rate of gun ownership. Individuals in a firearm owning home are close to 5 times more likely to commit suicide than the individuals who do not own firearms. Suicides outnumber homicides about 2 to 1, and research has shown no association between safe storage of guns and the gun suicide rate.
Well, let me start by saying I agree with Tom's definition of an assault weapon, but I think this is like a very good question to start with in any discussion about gun control, because the terminology and the definitions are key to what the legislation around them are going to be. And particularly, the question, Tim, you asked, what is an assault rifle? Well, I see that definition as separate from assault weapon, and legally, that's how it's recognized as well. Assault rifles we think of as being military-grade type firearms that have fully automatic capabilities, and those are already banned by the legislation. And then we introduce this concept of the assault weapon, which is talking about semi-automatic firearms that may cosmetically have features and similar with assault rifles, but that's used as a tool to try to expand gun control legislation to apply to weapons that are not fully automatic or not assault rifles. And there's confusion in within the media, within the political arena, and sometimes intentional, to make these assault weapons and assault rifles and make them sound like the same thing when they are not the same thing. And so I think that distinction has to be recognized, because it may be that several people at the table up here right now all agree that maybe assault rifles should be banned. But then we have a conversation, and you're saying assault weapon, and we're talking about 2 different things now as opposed to the same thing. So I think that distinction that needs to be made clear. I think it's unfortunate that the terminology is assault weapon versus assault rifle, because it does lead to confusion, I think, in the argument. So assault rifle, I say that is a weapon that is capable of fully automatic fire. It generally has selective fire capabilities. can be shot in semi-automatic modes, fully automatic modes, burst-capable modes, as compared to a assault weapon, which is a semi-automatic weapon, one trigger per bullet type of firing rate. And also let me say that on the assault weapon side, there are things included in that statutory definition that probably are good things. I mean, grenade launchers are part of that too. So I mean, there are elements that are, at least conceivably have a good purpose, but it muddies the water when you have those two terms be so similar and talking about totally different sets of functionality.
Okay. Well, we support Senator Feinstein's definition of an assault weapon. And instead of calling it an assault rifle, we call it an assault weapon because on her list, she has a very lengthy list of the different types. And but mainly they're all semi-automatic weapons that have military features and have either detachable magazines or a fixed magazine that can accept more than 10 rounds, or in the case of semi-automatic shotguns, 5 rounds. Now, if you read over the list that she has on the website, it does include pistols, handguns, shotguns, rifles. There are a wide range of the different types of guns, so you can't really say to call it an assault rifle. Now, the United States Attorney for the District of Colorado, John Walsh, was on the Senate hearings today, and he was asked that same question: what is an assault weapon? And his answer was that they're generally rifles, and they are usually have a high muzzle velocity, capable of doing great damage. They're capable of high rates of fire, and they're capable of holding high capacity magazines. So if you take those definitions and compare them, that's basically what we're talking about when we call them assault weapons instead of assault rifles.
Thanks. Unfortunately, there's no such thing as an assault weapon. It doesn't exist. It's a figment of the gun control community's imagination. So what you got is those of us who can remember back in the 1980s can't recall or won't recall ever hearing the term assault weapon because it didn't exist. In the early 90s, what happened is a group of people, in particular one named Josh Sugarman, who now works for the Liberal Violence Policy Center, created this terminology. They polled and found out in the early 90s that there was a great deal of confusion between military-style weapons and rifles owned by individual citizens. And so they glommed onto that and took advantage of the fact that most people, if they saw a scary black weapon that looked something like an M16, they assumed that it had the full features and benefits and capabilities of an M16. So they coined the term assault weapon and started using that right up until and since the original 1994 to 2004 quote-unquote assault weapons ban. So this is strictly a marketing play. This is a figment of the imagination of gun control, of the gun control community. So there's no such thing. Fully automatic weapons have been restricted in the United States since the 1934 National Firearms Act. And no new fully automatic weapons have even been allowed to be registered since the 1986, I'll call it sort of so-called Firearm Owners Protection Act, because this is another one of these bills where, you name it correctly, it sounds nice, even though it's taking people's rights away. So essentially what's happened is a private citizen cannot obtain a fully automatic military-style weapon that was not registered pre-86. So what happens now is that there's a very small group of these weapons out there. They're essentially collector's items. They're extremely expensive. You do have to have a license to have one. You have to pay a tax to obtain one, and you have to register with the federal government in order to have that. So they're very strictly controlled. So essentially what you have in the marketplace today, if you went to one of the local gun shops here and bought an AR-15, or you were to get a AK-47 variant, is a semi-automatic rifle, like everyone has said, that is no different than a hunting rifle that would have a wood stock and a wood forend, okay? But because that's a traditional hunting rifle or shotgun, we all assume that, well, that must be okay. But as soon as you paint it black, and heaven forbid if you put a collapsible stock on it, which just makes it so that, I could use that weapon, and so could Suzanne, who's clearly a little smaller than me. We could adjust the stock and then both use it. It has some convenient features on it. Sometimes a handle, sometimes a flashlight attachment, different features and benefits that make it more usable. But other than that, and the fact that it's painted black, and it looks like the military-style weapon, that's the only comparison. I could take an AR-15, break it down, put a wooden stock on it, wooden 4.9, and make it very much look like a hunting rifle, and then all of a sudden, it's fine. But
Don, if you want to
oh, sorry.
I want to make sure we get to all the questions. So I wanted to open it up for maybe a little bit of crosstalk here. Did anybody want to respond to something that somebody else said on the last question?
Well, I'm going to respond to something Don said about assault weapons don't exist. I agree with your sentiment that they don't exist in a physical matter, but they are legislatively or have been defined. And so that's why I think it's really important that this distinction is made clear, that legislators have come up with this definition of something called an assault weapon. It's been codified in the law before. It's sought to be recodified in the law. And so regardless, I know it doesn't exist in terms of categorizing firearms, but the law certainly tries to categorize it that way. Politicians do. So I think the distinction needs to be very clear, so that, again, when discussions on gun control are occurring, people really know that we're not talking about machine guns. We're talking about something very different. And that's very central, I think, to the arguments that are made in the gun control debate.
Anybody else want to chime in? Okay. This question will start with Alex and we'll finish up with Tom. In your opinion, what are the limits of the Second Amendment? Does the right to bear arms extend to all types of weapons? Where's the line drawn? If it is limited, what should, in your opinion, the criteria be for determining which weapons should be banned and which should be legal?
Yeah, this is definitely a challenging question, maybe the most challenging question. Again, legally, the Supreme Court has ruled numerous times that the Second Amendment is not an unlimited right. There are legitimate reasons to restrict certain arms, and you can make various philosophical arguments about unlimited weapons control. An example being, the common case given for why you need it is, what happens if your neighbor wants to, build a nuclear bomb? And should that be allowed? Those types of cases are, in my opinion, so absurd, so unlikely that, I guess I don't care if we have legislation that prohibits that. It'd be like making legislation regarding if I fly to the moon, should I be allowed to claim a stake on it? Well, get there first, and then we can discuss, the practical matter of whether we legislate it. So then it comes back to on the less extreme side when we get down to where do you draw a line? I tend to look at, well, we have law enforcement officers, we have members of the military who have the right to carry various arms. They are individuals just like we are. The fact that you work for the government does not provide a separate set of rights that are over and beyond what a regular individual civilian has. So I tend to look in that direction. Now that puts me closer to the right to own an assault rifle, and I'm always open to the idea that maybe that goes too far. But I think at the very least, that's the starting point, because there is no basis for saying that a military serviceman has a higher or better right to bear arms than me as an American citizen. And maybe as more anecdotal evidence, a serviceman or a law enforcement officer, when they leave service, is able to purchase their firearm and take it with them. And so I think that also provides evidence to what you should at least be allowed to obtain legally as a citizen.
Okay. Well, we all know, as you said, that limits already are imposed on amendments. The First Amendment speech, you can't make statements that promote violence or incite illegal action. You can't tell lies that damage or defame a person or organization's reputation. Obscene material is not protected. So there are limits on each right. Now, the courts have already decided the limits on the Second Amendment. They decided that in 1939 that sawed-off shotguns and machine guns could be prohibited because they had no reasonable relation to the preservation or efficiency of a well-regulated militia. And they also made it clear that certain weapons used in warfare are not protected because the amendment limits people, and I want to make sure I get this correct, the amendment limits people to weapons in common use for lawful purposes like self-defense, and sawed-off shotguns may be useful for self-defense, but they are not in common use for that purpose. And then in 2008, they also concluded that it protects your right to own a handgun in your house for purposes of self-defense. So it's very clear that they've already issued limits on the Second Amendment. Now, if we're looking at assault weapons, you can't throw in there that you could use them for hunting, or you could use them for sport or target practice, because that's not part of the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment doesn't cover that. Are they in common use for lawful purposes right now? Because realistically, most people, when they're defending their home or themselves, are using handguns. So, and handguns are constitutional in the amendment. So, I guess in a long-winded way, I'm saying that yes, there are limits, and that's what I think the limit should be.
Thanks. It reads very simple. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms should not be infringed. It's not complicated. There's 27 words there, and I know people make a big deal out of it, and they try to make a big deal about the introductory phrase about militia, but there's nothing in here about limits or restrictions or self-defense or hunting or anything. There's none of that. So, and there's no indication that there should be any limits whatsoever. And if you think back to when the Second Amendment was written, I mean, what was happening? The United States was being born after a revolution where the citizens of the United States had to throw off a tyrannical government. So first and foremost, the reason for people to own firearms would be to protect itself from its own government. So to me, if the government, and with all due respect to the U.S. military, which I have many family members in, and police forces in the United States, there's no need for the military or police forces to be better armed than its own citizens. That mixture creates a significant problem when people who technically work for all of us, are better armed than we are. So we may have officials in office today who say, I'm not out to take your guns, I'm not out to restrict you, but it can be that slippery slope, and we can't predict who the president will be 4 years from now, or who the governor will be 4 years from now. And we can't say that we won't end up on a slope that takes us to a very bad place. So in my opinion, there should be no limits. Now, if you want to get into the question of firearms in common use at the time the Second Amendment was written, that certainly was, framers have written in their own writings, but that was more or less their intent. But you have to think back. Sorry? I'm sorry. You have to think back to what was in common use at the time. It was not uncommon for a private citizen to own a cannon. I mean, cannons used in the Revolutionary War by the colonials were owned by private citizens and provided by private citizens. Everyone owned a musket or a firearm. And today's equivalent, the most popular rifle, is the AR-15. So essentially, today's musket for a private citizen is an AR-15. Should we all have a cannon in our front yard too? Well, that's probably a stretch. But if you wanted to, I'm not the one who's going to tell you you can't have that. So in my opinion, no restriction.
Did you have a question, comment?
Could I interject a little thing?
You
mentioned party ownership.
Actually, would it be okay if we saved all questions till the end? I think it would be okay if we saved all questions till the end. I think it would stop the flow. We may not get to some end questions. So, thank you.
Supreme Court Justice Anton Scalia, quote, there are undoubtedly limits to a person's right to carry guns. Future court cases will determine what limitations on modern-day weapons are permissible. Another quote. My starting point, probably my ending point, will be what limitations are within the understood limitations that the society had at the time. I have other points, but they're really not
I'd like to
that
address
issue?
the common use.
Let's open up for
what was I going to mention about? Oh, it was with regards to common use. Part of the question there though is, yeah, were AR-15s in common use for significantly in the past 15 years? Maybe not, but there's also been an assault weapons ban in place until 2004 that would have prohibited them. So it's kind of a cart before the horse issue if you say, oh, well, it has to be in common use in order for it to be okay or to be allowable within the limitation, but then you ban it out right before it can ever be brought into common use. So I think there is a little bit of an issue with that. I mean, I can agree with the idea, does somebody, again, need a rocket launcher for self-defense? Probably not. But can you then draw the distinction that AR-15 is not a common use weapon, especially considering its popularity after the bit on the assault weapons ban?
The AR-15s have been very popular for years. Now, of course, after the tragedy at Sandy Hook, you can't get one now. They're sold out. They can't make them fast enough. So if you go to the local gun shops here, the shelves are empty. You can't get one. So when I watch that, that's citizens voting with their feet in their pocketbooks, right? So if we believe that collectively we all make pretty good decisions, given our freedoms and the ability to make independent decisions, it must be that buying an AR-15 is a pretty wise thing to do. And of course they're common use. They're the most commonly owned rifle in the United States today. So I guess that just fits the definition. Regarding some of the things you said that Scalia has said, I couldn't tell exactly if some of that came out of the Heller case or other things he's written. But if it came out of the Heller case, that's not actually in the Supreme Court decision. That's in the notes to the case or the dicta. So it's not actually precedent of the court. So, well, with all due respect to Justice Scalia, that's one man's opinion. And while again it's a very educated opinion, it's still one person's opinion, and that's not actually in any Supreme Court decision. Pardon?
Yeah.
Well, okay, you can put that in, but that's right. It's not in there. So that's not the law of the land today. When it comes to there was a comment about Second Amendment doesn't cover hunting and self-defense. Well, that's true, but it doesn't not cover it either. Again, the words I read were very clear. There are no restrictions at all. Not to be infringed. To me, that's very clear, and that covers everything, whether it's protecting yourself from your own government police forces, to self-defense, to hunting, to whatever the need might be.
I had a thought. You were talking about police and other citizens were better armed than citizens, but aren't they trained to learn how to use those weapons, and they don't just go out and they don't just put a gun in their hand and send them out to do this stuff? I mean,
Sure.
They do have to train them. So.
Well, does that mean as long as I'm trained, I can own it? Is that the compromise? As long as I'm willing to take some training beforehand, I can own a fully automatic weapon? Because I imagine there will be many people who would. Yeah, well, I'm saying that I think there are plenty of civilian, non-military, non-law enforcement individuals who have had the proper training, but who are still denied the right to own the same weapon.
Yeah, training. It's not complicated to learn how to fire these weapons. I'd be happy to take any one of you out to a range sometime and teach you how to do it. In a matter of minutes, you'll be doing it in a very safe fashion. So it's not a complicated issue. And if training were really the big deal, then back in August, we wouldn't have had New York City police officers inadvertently shooting 9 bystanders while trying to take down one perpetrator in front of the Empire State Building. You may recall that story. And so we can't say that police and the military are any better trained than civilians. I have the ability to get out and practice actually more than most police officers do. So there's no, it wouldn't be fair or appropriate to say that citizens aren't just as well trained as anyone in the police forces or military.
Sticking with the idea of the Second Amendment, because I think that is a huge part of why most people view the gun debate in the way that they do. This is less about court limits to it and more about your personal opinions on this. What do you think was the original intent of the Second Amendment? Is the Second Amendment outdated or no longer relevant today due to increases in technology and an increase in the size of the police force? And does the need for firearms extend beyond hunting and self-defense? So again, it's a little different than the last question. Our focus is more on your personal opinions or maybe your organization's views rather than court views. So this one we'll start with Susan.
Okay. Well, there was a PBS special that came on February 19th, and in it, they said that in April of 1775, it took each Minuteman 15 seconds to load, aim, and fire a single musket at the Redcoats. And it's obvious that our technology has changed since then. And semi-automatic rifles weren't even a thought in their heads back then when this was written. And it's not outdated. It's not no longer relevant. I mean, every times have changed, so things have to be interpreted differently. But nobody's asking that we just do away with the Second Amendment and do away with every guns. That's not in any anybody's thought. That's not anybody's head. But the original intent is exactly what it says: to allow people to keep in their arms to ensure a well-organized militia or well-regulated militia. So these, if that's the original intent of the Second Amendment, I don't think that the proposition or the proposals that have been put forth infringe on that right.
Yeah, thanks. Well, obviously, I don't think it's outdated, and I don't think it's irrelevant. I think it's completely relevant to everything we have going on today. You know, there's the phrase that the Second Amendment exists to protect all the others, especially when you're talking to journalists who are, gun grabbers, to protect the First Amendment for them. Because I may not agree with what they write in the New York Times or other newspapers, but I fully support, their right to publish that and to say it. Therefore, turn that around. I don't think that they have the right to come after me and restrict my Second Amendment rights. That's a two-way street, right? If they choose not to carry or not to own a rifle, not to target shoot, not to hunt, not to own a firearm or go anywhere near a firearm, they won't come to my house because I have one or whatever. That's their right to do that. But that does not give them the right to project their anti-gun views onto me and to take that right away. So the Second Amendment absolutely is still relevant. Again, as I said before, the first reason for putting that in place was to protect all of your other God-given rights, or natural rights. If you don't believe in a God, that's fine, but they are your natural rights regardless. And to protect those, today, it sometimes takes a firearm to do that, whether you're having to protect yourself from a government or a criminal. And it may have taken 15 seconds once upon a time to load a musket, but I am not carrying a musket to a mugging, okay? Because if the mugger has a semi-automatic handgun, I want one too. And I want one that's maybe even a little better than his or hers. So, again, while the firearms in use have changed over time, that has not changed the need or the necessity for the Second Amendment.
It sounds like everyone's in favor of the Second Amendment, and that's why we have courts to interpret it. I did hear the NRA president, when asked, when have citizens used arms to take over a government? And he did cite Tennessee citizens in a small town in the early 1900s overthrew their own government. And they couldn't have done it if they didn't have weapons. The one argument we'll hear all the time will be that we need to protect the citizenry against the government. And I thought if we have to go back early 1900s Tennessee small town, that's pretty far-fetched.
Well, we build off that, and I do think that the original intent, the framers' intent, was central to that idea that the populace did need to be able to protect itself from a tyrannical government. I mean, that was a function at that time. Whether that outdates it, I don't think it does. And nor do I think that the fact that they preface the Second Amendment with the statement about a need for a well-regulated militia in any way limits or provides additional rights for what follows, which is the idea that people do have the right to bear arms free of infringement. So just because you preface the statement with, that the purpose of it was to have a well-regulated militia not being in the interest of a free state, that in no way says, well, now you can't use that, or your right to bear arms limits you from self-defense, hunting, sport, or any other reason need that you have. So that is my sense of it. Is that the framers' intent? Sure, there's this idea that it was to protect them not only from others, but from a potentially tyrannical government. But that's not a limitation upon what other rights you have in connection with the right to bear arms.
Alex, does anybody want to respond?
Just two things real quick. I guess one thing I would say is if anybody thinks the Second Amendment is outdated or irrelevant, there's a process in the Constitution. You can go ahead and put together a team of people, get your petitions together, get the states together, and overturn the Second Amendment. If there's a majority who want to do that, fine. I'd be happy to see that process take place. But no one does that. The changes of late are proposed as presidential, what do they call it, executive orders, or we want to change it in the law, or we want to try to change it through the court system. Well, this is playing around the periphery. If you're really so dead set against the Second Amendment, then go through the process and have it overturned. That's what I was thinking. Nobody proposes that. Secondly, turn it around. If it's outdated and irrelevant, okay, because there's the phrase, when citizens have weapons, the government fears them. When the government only has the weapons, the citizens fear the government. So let's look at a few examples. I mean, what happened in the Soviet Union when there were no weapons for citizens, right? They were wiped out by the millions. Same thing in communist China. You can go case after case after case around the world. Not only are people in fear of their government, they're killed. All right. If you want to talk to a couple of friends of mine who are immigrants, legal immigrants from Belarus, living under basically a dictator named Lukashenko, they are not allowed to have firearms in that country. Their freedoms are heavily restricted. And they can tell you the stories of what it's like to live in that atmosphere versus living here in the United States. So turn it around. If it's irrelevant, then great. Let's all live like those other countries. But I have personally no interest in that. So I think it's extremely relevant that we all have the right to keep and bear arms.
Anybody else want? We'll move on to the fourth question. A lot of the gun regulation argument has centered on the lethality of the weapons used in high-profile stories like Sandy Hook. Examples being banning assault weapons or high-capacity magazines. Discuss the merits or the fallacies of these arguments. Arguments being the focus on the weapons that is not seen with crimes committed with non-firearm weapons. So we'll start with Don on this one.
Okay, thanks. So we have some evidence that we can look at, right? The original quote-unquote assault weapons ban was from 1994 to 2004. There were a number of studies done during that 10-year time frame and after, not strictly by Second Amendment proponents, but also by objective people who are originally in favor of that the AWB or assault weapons ban. There was no clear evidence, there's none in any study that says that violence dropped after the ban was put in place in '94, nor did violence increase after the ban was not renewed in 2004. It essentially had no effect whatsoever. So we know that banning, in this case, so-called assault weapons, has zero effect. All it does is take away freedoms from Americans. When we talk about the lethality of the weaponry or high-capacity magazines, again, high-capacity magazine, I could go on kind of like I did about what an assault weapon is. There's essentially no such thing. There are magazines made to fit in certain handguns or rifles. They come in a variety of sizes. While 10 seems to be thrown around as a limit, New York State just decided it's 7. And put in a ban, excuse me, except for police officers, of anyone having a magazine with more than 7 rounds. So this is again just another made up item. Magazines are made to fit certain weapons, and they just come in certain capacities. They're made to fit that weapon. There's no high capacity. Is really no relevance. As far as lethality goes, actually an AR-15 is not really the most lethal weapon out there, and then most AR-15s, if you want to look at the round that it carries, is what's called a .223 or .223. That's the size of the bullet on that round, and that's actually a relatively small round. But the reason that is carried is primarily these are built with specifications garnered from the U.S. military. The .223 is a relatively lightweight round, so it's powerful enough for the job, but not so heavy that if you have to carry this in your backpack and you have to carry extra ammunition with you when you're in the U.S. military, that it's weighting you down too much. Because you certainly can buy rifles at much higher, with much larger bullet or much higher caliber than a .223. So the AR-15 is really not extreme from that perspective. As a matter of fact, it's kind of on the lower end in terms of size of the cartridge. So all of these things are focusing on the right things, and I think some of the later questions we're going to get to probably what are the right things to focus on. But all these issues about lethality, high capacity magazines, these are all just red herrings, really taking us away from the discussions that we should be having. Tom?
I'm glad Don mentioned the assault weapons ban from 1994 to 2004. And if I heard Don correctly, he said there wasn't a study done that indicated it made a difference. And I do have a study, 2004 study, commissioned by President George W. Bush's Justice Department that found assault weapon use in guns dropped by 17 to 72% in 6 cities during the decade that it was banned. On the other hand, the use of large caliber ammunition magazines increased through the use through 1990s. The ban did not apply to weapons acquired before 1994. It dropped when the assault weapons were banned in 6 cities that were studied.
I think with regards to lethality, I think especially when we use the AR-15 as an example, I think it's more of a perception issue than a reality one. Somebody looks at an AR-15 and they say, well, that looks like an M16 machine gun. That thing must be able to spit out bullets really fast. And the reality, of course, it's a semi-automatic. It shoots out bullets as quick as you pull the trigger, just like any other handgun or semi-automatic weapon you might have. So it looks scary because it shares the exact same body and stock as a military-grade assault rifle. But the reality is that from a lethality standpoint, it is there's no higher rate of fire than you experience with a similar semi-automatic. And as far as the high-capacity magazines, I think all you do when you restrict, you say, okay, well, you're not allowed to have a 30-round drum for your magazine for your rifle. Well, criminals in particular, but people who want to go out and use guns for violent means, they're smart enough to know that there's a solution to that, right? You bring more guns that are already loaded. You don't solve the problem by just restricting the size of the magazine, because it's just too easy to work around. If you follow that argument, all right, so now let's say you say, okay, well, you can only take a single shotgun. Well, if you make it harder on the criminal, and he says, okay, well, now I have to have a single shotgun, if he's intent on hurting people, lots of people, he's going to say, all right, now it makes more sense for me to build an explosive device. He's going to find some other alternative. You say you can't have explosives, or you restrict the ability to buy the materials to do explosives. Now you say, well, it's easier to do chemical weapons. Whatever you try to put in place to prevent this lethality perception, the criminal will find a way to find something more lethal, or that meets their needs for whatever they're going to do. So I think the lethality question, is more of a perception issue than a reality, because from a practical standpoint, an individual who's bent on doing one of these things can work around it.
Okay. During the Tucson shootings, Gabby Gifford was hit. 26 people were wounded or injured because the shooter had a magazine that held 33 rounds. The 13th shot hit a 9-year-old girl who died. When the gun jammed and he had to try to change the magazine, that's when he was tackled and was able to be subdued. If he only had 10 shots and had to change to a second magazine, even if it only took a couple seconds, that could have been a couple seconds when somebody was able to take him down. So that little girl could have been alive today. Now, we'll come to that in a second. Well, I'll go ahead and say now. The 223 that Dawn was talking about, that bullet, if I've read my correct research, was the bullets, the type of bullets that the shooter used in Newtown. And from what I've understood, it can't kill a deer because it's too weak. And so Connecticut has banned it from being used to go deer hunting. But the bullets that he put in these children, one of the children no longer had a jaw. I mean, his left hand that they had to hide it. So it can do great damage to a person. It may not take down a bear or a deer, but it can do a lot of damage to a person. So, and the reason I bring all this stuff up is because we're trying to, this is an issue about gun safety and it's a public health issue. And if you outlaw these kind of magazines, then the chances are greater that the deaths will go down because it's not as easy to use. Of the 142 guns recovered from mass shootings from 1982 to 2012, 103 were semi-automatic handguns or assault weapons. So these are the weapons of mass killers because they do so well at mass killing. So these are, if they weren't that lethal, they would, and I've heard the arguments that if they weren't that lethal, then they would just use something else, but they don't because they're so lethal.
So if I could, can I reply to that?
Sure.
A 223 round.
It is not a debate.
Okay, fair enough. But just to maybe correct some things or to show a little balance, a 223 round typically wouldn't use for hunting a deer. That is correct. It could be, but it's probably not your best choice for the situation. Okay, but it's fully fine for shooting small game. Will work just well. So to say that it can't be used for hunting purposes would be incorrect. Now, I don't mean to backtrack from what I said a minute ago. I didn't mean to imply that a 223 round is not a lethal round if it's pointed at you and fired. Okay, it absolutely is and can be. All right, but when it's talked about in the media as if someone's launching a grenade at you when they're firing a 223 round at you, that's when they're overplaying. All right, and really making it much more than it is. And to say that killers, especially mass killers, are choosing an AR-15 and a 223 round because of its lethality, that's just not, that doesn't hold up in the FBI statistics. So rifles actually are used very infrequently for gun killings. As a matter of fact, hands and fists and hammers and clubs kill more people per year, according to FBI statistics, than any kind of rifle, AR-15 or otherwise. All right, so unless we want to take each contractor and do it yourselfer and say, okay, before you can buy a hammer at Lowe's, we're going to have Lowe's do a NICS background check on you to make sure that you don't have any, predilection for violence or felonies in your background before you can buy a hammer to drive a few nails. That's basically what we're talking about here. So the rifle in and of itself, again, is being turned into this monster, but the gun is not what killed people. It's the person who killed people, all right? And so I think trying to play it that the AR-15, sorry, is somehow this lethal killer is just not fair and inappropriate. As far as the high-capacity magazines, 30 gets thrown a lot as if it's this problematic magazine and it's somehow a contributor to these shootings. And again, that's just not true. I never use the names of any of these shooters, but I'll just refer to events, okay? Because I don't think it's appropriate for these people to get any kind of publicity whatsoever. But the shooter at Virginia Tech had a Walther P22 22 caliber handgun, okay? He also had a Glock 19 9mm handgun. He had not one 30 round magazine in his possession. He had, let me double check here. He had, I believe it was 19 10 round 22 caliber magazines, and he had 10 15 round 9mm magazines. So he had plenty of ammunition to do damage, but he had none of the supposedly so-called, high capacity magazines that are being talked about being banned. And that Virginia Tech shooting is still the #1 most deadly shooting in the United States. So again, the magazine issue is another red herring to draw your attention away from what the real problems are.
You want to respond?
I do. The Colorado shooter is determined to kill. He will find a way to do so. That may be true, but the AR-15 enabled him to kill with almost unparalleled efficiency and speed until it jammed. We need to make it easy and legal for homicidal maniacs to rack up body counts. What justification can there be for allowing people to buy weapons with the ability to shoot 50 to 60 rounds per minute?
You said it's not a debate, but you're putting facts out there that are correct in terms of 50 to 60 rounds per minute is not necessarily correct.
I might suggest that even if that is correct, any other semi-automatic firearm has the exact same rate of fire. So the idea that the AR-15 is somehow deadlier, has more capacity to kill more people in the same amount of time compared to a handgun is not correct, because you can fire both of them at the same rates.
Can gun regulation prevent gun violence? The argument that you hear quite often is if one individuals who would commit gun violence just ignore laws restricting gun ownership, and wouldn't that just produce regulations that actually keep guns out of the hands of criminals? We'll start with Tom.
States that have the most restrictions tend to also have the lowest gun violence.
Including Illinois?
Illinois, I believe, Pennsylvania is about in the middle. Illinois, I used to live in Illinois. I know Chicago's getting a heck of a reputation. Oh, Illinois was #2 in restrictions. And the amount of gun violence, gun murders was 2.8, when the average of all 50 states is, I believe, around 5. No, it's 3.6. So Illinois is still less than the average.
Well, this is still a city there.
Terry. See Tim up there? He's our bouncer. The one man, he seems like a nice guy, but he'll drag you out back. So let's save that till the end, if you would. Sorry, Tom.
That's my main point. And I have, you don't want to hear all the numbers, but I have them here.
Well, I tried to look up some of the stats and that kind of thing to get an idea of, I've always been a little bit, I will give full credit to the idea that, sure, regulation, ban, legal enforcement certainly has some amount of deterrence effect. But generally, deterrence from a legal standpoint is pretty weak, because the majority of crimes, especially crimes of passion, that happen in the moment, people aren't thinking about the ramifications, the consequences of the action. When I look for stats on gun control, who's got most of what stats I found are where are the most guns and where is the most gun violence. The truth is, it's all over the place. states. There isn't a clear, to me, it doesn't look like a clear pattern within the U.S. state by state or worldwide. Some countries in Europe allow you to own fully automatic weapons if you are a collector, for instance. The idea that I just don't think there's a lot of strong statistical evidence one way or the other. There is evidence certainly in some states that do have more control, that there is less gun crime, but there's also that same set of stats for other states. So I don't know. I think the statistical look at it doesn't support really one way or the other whether the regulation reduces the incidence of gun violence. But more to, I kind of alluded to this in the previous question. It's not so much whether the weapons bans will reduce gun violence. It's the criminals will find ways to commit their crimes, whether through gun violence or through other means. If somebody's intent on committing a crime, they will. Especially, I think, and I know there's a question down the line here regarding the reasons for violence, the reasons for gun violence. I think unless you're addressing those, the bans aren't going to do anything to prevent it, or at least in any significant way. And you really have to attack what are the sources, the causes of criminal behavior, gun violence, if you really want to see a reduction in it. If you go the banning route, the criminals will find a way around it.
This is an argument I've heard a lot. If you take away the high-capacity magazines or the assault rifles, criminals still get them, and they'll still, and just, no, we won't have them. But that's kind of like saying that, it's kind of like saying that we should do away with all the do away with the laws on drinking and driving because people are still going to do it. So let's just throw that law out. But that law was put into place because Mothers Against Drunk Driving pushed for better legislation, excuse me. And we have laws that say you have to wear a seatbelt. People still drive without seatbelt, but if they're caught doing it, they get in trouble. There are so many different things that you could go to. You can drive, but you have speed limits, you have age restrictions, you have to get insurance, you have to get a license, and you have to get so many different things are regulated, but we don't have the same kind of regulations when it comes to guns. And all of those laws and restrictions are just designed to keep people safe and safe from harm. And let's talk about background checks, because that's one of the ones that I hear, well, criminals won't undergo a background check. Well, and somebody said something about Chicago, Illinois. The reason Illinois has such a problem, and I did misspeak earlier, our founders were in Indiana, not Illinois, but most of their guns are coming from out of state. And so they're having problems there, not because they're restricting the gun use there and that people are getting them legally, but they're coming from out of state where it's legal to get. So right now, 90% of Americans agree with universal background checks. And background checks have prevented 2 million criminals from getting guns. Here in North Carolina, private individuals make up between 10 and 20% of the gun sellers in North Carolina gun shows. A state law requires all sellers to make sure a handgun buyer has a pistol permit, and which requires that the holder undergo a background check before he can buy the handgun. So there's already a law in place in North Carolina that says you can't have a handgun unless you undergo a background check. There is not a requirement for the private sale of long guns. And so we make laws to keep people safe. And no, criminals are not always going to follow them, but there are we're not trying to make criminals out of law-abiding citizens, but if you go that logic, then it just doesn't make sense. There are so many different things that are already on the books that we would just have to do away with if we didn't apply the same common sense to gun legislation.
I have a different view on this. Gun regulation has no connection to gun violence. Okay, so we've all watched as the FBI crime stats have dropped for years now, right, for the most part. And yet the number of gun owners in the United States and the number of guns owned by gun owners in the United States has risen practically every year, especially in the last presidential term and even before. Right? I mean, there are signs in gun shops, for those of you who don't visit gun shops often, basically often with Obama up there as salesman of the year. All right. So every time there's talk of a restriction, again, people vote with their feet in their pocketbooks. So there's been an increase in the number of firearms owned by U.S. gun owners. If that were true, then there should be people dying on the street every second of every day, and that's not happening. The number of violent crimes is decreasing. I'll go back to my comments about the 1994 to 2004 assault weapons ban. No effect. Several studies. I can go to the National Institute of Justice. There's several who've looked at it. No effect in the early 90s. No effect in 05, 06, and a couple years following as far as an increase goes. So essentially, gun control has no effect on violence. As Alex said, if a criminal's going to commit a crime, they're going to commit a crime. All right. And if weapons are grandfathered and already out there, they're going to find a way to get them. They'll just get them in the black market. Criminals don't buy their guns legally to begin with. They don't undergo the background checks to begin with. The background checks are typically only conducted by legal gun owners because they're the only ones that will undergo it, obviously. That would be how it would work. So, when the question here about won't individuals who would commit gun violence just ignore the laws? Well, absolutely. And will regulations actually keep guns out of the hands of criminals? No. I mean, it's just a proven fact. When we talk about, there's a comment about automobile restrictions. Fine, we can have that discussion. I think some of what was put out there is incorrect. But let's just go back to the Constitution for a minute. We're talking about the Second Amendment and the right to keep bear firearms. There's nothing in the Constitution about the right to keep and drive a car. All right. If you're going to compare alcohol and driving, let's do that for a second. You cannot be imbibing alcohol and carry a firearm, at least carry concealed. All right. That's already illegal, and we would take away your right to have a firearm if you did that. And yet you can drive around, and I don't know how many DWIs can you get before they take away your license in your car. And even then, it doesn't stop you from getting in the car and driving it again anyway, right? And just getting caught again. So I don't think there's really a comparison there. Driving is a privilege. Owning a firearm is a natural right documented in the Constitution. As far as the universal background checks go, GRNC and me personally, we are very much against this, because if you look at how universal background checks are used in countries that have done it, they are the precursor to confiscation. There's just no question there's a correlation there, a connection. So if anyone tells you, well, we need universal checks to prevent private sales are likely in the single digits in terms of the percentage of total guns transferred in the United States per year, and many of those are through inheritances, private sales, me selling to a friend of mine who I know is not a criminal, maybe getting one from a family member. So oftentimes these are situations where the buyer and the seller know each other, all right? And even if they're not, typically you don't find, and never do I know of a case where a criminal has purchased a firearm in a legal private transaction and then gone off to commit a crime. So none of the mass shooters we're talking about, none of the criminals typically held out as examples, purchased their guns in private transactions. So there is no need for universal background checks.
Somebody want to respond?
I sure do. 63% of private sellers sold guns to purchasers who said they could not pass a background check. 86% of Americans support a background check. 74% of the NRA support a background check. This is a quote from Robin Anderson, who bought the guns for the Columbine shooters. "I would not have bought a gun for Eric and Dylan if I had to give any personal information or submit to any kind of check at all.
I'll point out that the Columbine massacre did occur after the assault was ban went into effect.
All right. The next question is actually a good question for libertarians who favor more power with local and state government than federal government.
Don't ask for a question.
Well, I'm excited to hear people's answers to this question. How much of gun regulation should be handled by the federal government? Would it be better or worse to leave it to the state or local governments to determine what restrictions are appropriate? And this one, we start with Alex.
Well, my preference in most legislation is that it be more local because, well, one, I feel like you have a better idea of what you want to occur within your own backyard. But also because simply it's easier to avoid situations where if you're unhappy with the regulation or legislation in place, moving across county lines is much simpler than moving across state line versus moving to a brand new country to avoid a particular regulation. So I almost always would say I prefer and even in the gun ownership arena, I would say I probably prefer local. At the same time, you do need to have some. Well, the Supreme Court has already ruled that the Second Amendment does apply at the state level. So there is some limitations around that. But I do think there is an advantage to having more control at the local level, because on both sides, I think that provides opportunity. You could have regulation ordinances that would allow less restrictive gun laws in certain areas, so individuals who are willing to accept that risk can choose to live there. And you could also have areas that have higher gun control, more restrictive ordinances, where individuals who are looking for I'm going to quote, safer environment can choose to live there as well, instead of having one law that rules everything, only one level of firearms available.
Moms Demand Action feels that the federal government needs to play an important nonpartisan role. One state may have the toughest gun laws in the country, but if they're near a state with lax laws, then it's going to be an uphill battle. So the supply will always be coming in. The Mayors Against Illegal Guns group studied trace data publicized by the ATF between 2006 and 2009. And every year, North Carolina was among the top 10 states to supply guns used in crimes around the country. So if we're sending out guns to other countries, to other states, then obviously the federal government needs to regulate and not leave it up to the states, because the states are going to always have problems keeping the restrictions in line.
If we were to have gun control, I would much prefer that it be as local as possible if it had to be there. It's much easier for any of us to go to a city council meeting or to approach our city council members, county commissioners, to drive to Raleigh next if we had to do that. Again, our legislative action team does that, and we have relatively unfettered access to state senators and state representatives to present ideas we have about changes we want to see in North Carolina law. Going to Washington and getting into that morass is a whole other story altogether. Each of us then becomes that much smaller in terms of being able to have any kind of individual effect on what goes on in Washington, and each of us becomes a little bit less powerful in influencing that, just because of the massive amount of money that can flow into DC. So, and this would be true for any legislation, I guess, in my opinion. I would much rather see it start or occur at the local level, and as little as possible at the federal level. Not even talking about the fact that, to me, the Second Amendment is very clear. The federal government has no place taking away your firearms rights.
30,000 people a year die from gunshots in the United States. That's on average. Guns don't cause violence, but access to guns turns violence deadly. If a gun is used during a domestic violence assault, there's a 23-fold increased likelihood that the victim will die. The first week after the purchase of a handgun, the suicide rate among firearm purchasers was 57 times as high as the general population. Gun bans can have an impact. In 1991, 15 years after Washington, D.C. banned handguns, and you understand, so it had been in effect, but then 2008 it was declared unconstitutional. Researchers from the University of Maryland conducted a study to assess the impact of the ban. The ban started in 1976, and here we are 15 years later. They studied 1968 to 1987, found that homicides by firearm fell by 25%, and suicides committed with firearms dropped by 23%.
Tom, did you want to address the local?
No, I don't care. We got to do something. I don't care where it's done.
So I want the panel know we're at 8:30 right now. Is everyone okay if we were to go a few minutes more in order to address the last question, or anybody hired to go?
Take our question. A couple quick things. Suicide is unaffected by guns. If you look at suicide rates around the world, even in countries that have much higher or much greater gun restriction than here in the U.S., suicide rates are essentially unaffected. Anyone who wants to commit suicide is going to find a way to do that. In North Carolina, one of the things GRC is proud of is there is an issue with firearms in a domestic violence situation, and that's why GRNC a few years ago had the law changed in North Carolina such that if a person is in a domestic violence situation, they can apply for and receive an expedited emergency concealed carry permit, and then use that permit to immediately go out and acquire a firearm. So we wanted to make sure that predominantly females, but anyone in a domestic violence situation had the ability to be able to equally protect themselves from someone bent on doing them harm. As far as the regulations and how it should be handled, you know, I'll just say, you know, Washington D.C., Chicago, and even island nations like the UK, Ireland, and Jamaica, where at their federal level they banned all weapons. After they did that, saw violence and firearms violence increase, because again, the criminals could still get the weapons, just not the law-abiding citizens.
Okay. This last question asks if is there common ground that individuals from both sides of the debate can sides focus on other causes of gun violence, such as treatment for mental health disorders, social dissonance, or even the militarization of the military and what the war on drugs has contributed to gun violence? Are there any realistic or politically feasible ways to minimize or reduce gun violence while protecting the Second Amendment? So, any common sense ways that we can all agree on that? I don't know if any of them are politically feasible or necessarily common sense, but I'd like to hear if you guys think there are.
Is this Suzanne's turn to start?
Yes, this one would be Suzanne's.
Well, as a representative of Moms Man Action, I'm not able to answer them personally because I am here representing them. I can say that what we're doing is in response to a public health crisis. Not very different to the secondhand smoke and airbags in cars. We would ask this legislation of Mitt Romney, George W. Bush, or Bill Clinton. It's about health and safety and how best to take care of our children.
Two of the real issues we have to get at here have nothing to do with firearms. Tom quoted a number of how many firearm deaths occur in the United States per year. But if you take a look inside that number, the vast majority of those shootings are drug-related or happen in the midst of a crime being committed. Okay, they are not amongst law-abiding citizens. They are not accidents in the home place. That is exceedingly rare. So essentially what we have is a crime problem, essentially primarily focused around drugs and drug culture and the drug industry, is basically what they are, that we have to do something about. When it comes to the one-off mass shooting like we've seen in the last few years, let's take a look at what's happening there. These are predominantly, well, no, I think exclusively, young, white male Caucasians who are disaffected from society. They've grown up to that stage in their life, typically having issues in school, issues with friends or not having friends, troubles at home, whatever, that prompt them to go out and commit these heinous acts. We back that up then by giving them a wild amount of publicity in the mainstream media that they typically have not had in their lifetimes. So whether it's one of those young men who intends to shoot himself before the event is over, or not, as in Colorado, this is sort of their MO. So we have to figure out, why is it that young men in this society are sometimes having this problem? We need to watch out for these kids, and because I want to help these kids as much as anybody. I don't like that this is happening, but we have to watch out for these kids and figure out who are the teenagers. You know, we were all teenagers once. We know what that means to be one of them. We need to watch out for them. You can see the signs. We can watch and look for the kid who's having difficulty, and then figure out a way for them to be more acculturated and to figure out a way to fit in. All right. When it comes to the war on drugs and the number of shootings attached to that, well, I'm sure as libertarians, and if you're readers of Reason magazine and other sources like that, you know all about the thinking on the war on drugs. I tend to think very much like the articles published in Reason and other places like that. The war on drugs is a whole different thing we have to get at. It's essentially a failure, or it is a failure, not essentially a bad verb right out there. It is a failure, and we need to combat that a whole different way. If we did, then maybe we'd have a shot at taking some of the violence and shootings out of the drug industry that get counted in these totals that we all hear about. If we could take care of those two large issues and start doing some things differently than we have in the past, then I think we have a shot at increasing the number and the rate of these shootings of firearms that we see. But it's not the firearm. It's these situations that cause the problem. It's these situations that we have to get at. So one of my big concerns always is when Senator Feinstein, Representative McCarthy, Governor Cuomo, Schumer, you can go down the whole list, when they keep presenting these changes to us, these restrictions to us again and again and again, it's the definition of insanity, right? Doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. Except these folks, not only do they want to do the same thing over and over again, they want to do more of the same thing over again. So, with all due respect, I'd say I think they need to recheck their approach, because doing that same thing over and over again, expecting a different result, is not going to be the answer to the problem.
Tom?
So many facts and figures here, finding which one I want to use to refute what I've heard. NRA has blocked federal dollars to research causes and effects of gun violence. They've blocked it. Been very effective at blocking it and other lobbying efforts. So we don't always have as good a research as we'd like to. But more police makes a difference. New York City added 7,000 police and had an 81% reduction in homicides. Having swarming crime hotspots, having cops around these hotspots reduces crime. Project Safe Neighborhoods, where ex-cons are supported in terms of offering help for shelter, training, and education, and also threaten with long sentences if they come back. Rewards to tipsters, $500 to $1,000, an action that today may generate respect, makes a difference. Background checks on private gun sales, including gun shows, supported by 87% of Americans and 83% of gun owners, 69% of NRA members. One gun purchase per person per month would limit. Registration of handguns, and Don had mentioned, beware of that, doesn't have to be collected by the government. It could be collected by somebody else. So that is supported by 79% of Americans, 69% of police chiefs, 61% of gun owners, and 59% of NRA members. Banning the sale of assault weapons as well as high-capacity magazines that can hold more than 10 bullets at a time. And supporting the availability and funding of mental health and substance abuse treatments to all individuals. These are resolutions of the Progressive House of Representatives Caucus.
Well, I would say as far as where there's common ground, let me start by saying where I think maybe there isn't common ground or where the discussion will get hung up. I think that the public safety issue is the major hang-up. We all agree that we want a reduction in gun violence, we want public safety, but there's a value judgment that goes into what's safer. Is an armed populace safer or is an unarmed populace safer? And I think there's a lot of emotion charged up in that too, and I think that prevents common ground between both sides of the debate. What I do wish would be more discussion be around is on the causation. What is it societal within our society that makes us have higher violent crime rates than other countries in the world? And if as much effort went into those activities, into identifying what the causation is and what some of the solutions are, I think we would start to see a decrease in violent crime, not just gun crime, but just violent crime in general. Don hit on most of the what I feel are some of the causation issues, but I do wish there was more of a dialogue, more effort. If we could divert half the effort that's on the gun debate to solving issues about mental health disorders, war on drugs, the poverty cycle of crime. If we could focus on those, I think we could actually really achieve some actual forward progress in reducing gun violence. And those are all things I think most people on both sides of the debate would agree are good things to focus on. So that would be, I guess, my wish list would be to see more effort spent in those areas rather than diverting attention onto the gun control debate. Not to say that the debate isn't healthy. There are public safety issues to discuss, and those are important. But I just wish there was more attention focused on those issues.
All right. I have a couple of just quick follow-up questions. Before I do that, there is a little bit of a time discrepancy, so I wanted to invite either Suzanne or Thomas to give you guys a few minutes to sort of, if you want to make a statement or you wanted to sort of, like I said, there is a little bit of time discrepancy, so I wanted to invite if you guys wanted to speak for a little bit to sort of maybe establish a little more time.
A good research on unusual events, shootings remain unusual in America. It's hard to do and therefore expensive. Congress choked off funding for gun-related research starting in 1996, saying that much of the analysis was politically slanted against gun ownership. Current legal restrictions prohibit funding research with results that advocate or promote gun control. The Department of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms prohibited from tracing or sharing information about how often a dealer sells guns that end up seized in crimes, and stops doctors from gathering data about their patients' gun ownership or use. Who really wants to know causes? Certainly not the NRA.
Okay, well, I've got a couple things. Somebody said earlier that gun ownership versus gun deaths is all across the board. And I have a graph here that shows that the more guns there are in the state, the more gun deaths there are in the state. And Wyoming, Alabama, Montana are at the top of the list. Hawaii, New Jersey, Massachusetts are down here at the bottom of the list. New York's down there.
Surprising.
So I think restrictions do make a difference. Now another thing that I had pulled up is I think I heard about you may have heard the myth that crime rate has been skyrocketing in the UK after their gun control law went into effect. But what really happened is that the UK police changed its system for reporting crime since implementing new gun control laws. And so the change in reporting crime made it appear that the crime rate went up, but the British Crime Survey shows a decrease in crime. So that's something that you have to keep in mind, that just because any kind of stats you can research and find out if they're true. Snopes is actually really good for that too. They have something on Australia. If you go back and check on Snopes and ask if the crime rate went up in other areas after they banned guns, you're going to find a lot of information that you didn't know was out there. And it's going to be contradictory to what you've heard. And in fact, I'm looking at the graph, the crime, all of it, went down from 1997 to 2003. It went down 25%. So that was after the ban came into effect. You know, I've got a whole lot of stats and I have a whole lot of information, but I guess the bottom line is that we're just trying to keep everybody safe, and we don't ever want a tragedy like Newtown or Virginia Tech or Aurora or Tucson or any of these other tragedies. We don't ever want them to happen again. We're just trying to work to make sure that we can figure out a way to make that law.